It's going. Okay, so I'm enjoying going through Daniel. I've been encouraging you to have a read of the chapter that's coming up. It's an amazing book. I mean, it gets fairly difficult when we get to chapter 7, 8 and 9 because there's dreams of the future, predictions. That's quite one of the more interesting chapters in the whole of the Old Testament. But this is Daniel, the three young men in Babylon. This story takes place in the same year as what the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed. So you may remember that, and it's good to look online. If you look online at the previous sermons, or if you don't get everything in the day, Stephen's often putting it on the same day as what it's preached, and you can just get a look at what's happened and get the flow as this book unfolds. So Daniel and these three young guys had been taken off into captivity as hostages. And then things went on in Israel until there was a rebellion from the king again. And so the temple was destroyed. The whole nation was pretty well decimated, and what was left of the population largely taken off into captivity. But that was some years before. If you remember that the young men had asked to eat vegetables, that Daniel had interpreted one of the king's dreams. That was about 16 or 17 years before this. So some years have gone by, and the young guys now are about 33 years of age, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And so Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image of gold. It's very much like the one that he dreamt about in last week's sermon. Maybe the dream that he had gave him the idea of setting up an image. And he's... you think he would have learnt, because in the dream that Daniel interpreted, he's the head of gold, but it's meant to actually humble him. But it seems to actually have the opposite effect. And so this image that he sets up is 28 metres high. If you can imagine 28 metres. And it's 2.8 metres wide. So it's one of the largest images that's pictured in the ancient world. It's not quite as big as the Colossus of Rhodes. If you know any of the wonders of the ancient world, Colossus of Rhodes is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but it's almost as big as that. So it's might have been an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself or of one of his gods. It doesn't really say. So on average, this is funny, on average you are about 5 or 6 times higher than you are wide. I'm not talking about girth, I'm talking about width. So you're 5 or 6 times higher than you are. But this statue was 10 times higher than it was wide. So it's not quite in proportions of what a human might be. So they think that maybe it was on a pedestal. And that would have allowed it to actually look appropriate. Otherwise, it's much higher than what you would expect it to be wide, significantly higher. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So it's set up on the plain of Dura, which is probably a suburb was outside of Babylon. And all of his dignitaries, not the common people. This bowing down to this image was not expected of everybody. Just the dignitaries and important people throughout his kingdom are summoned to come to the dedication of the image. And so they assemble as they're commanded in front of the image, and that includes Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And for some reason Daniel's not there. We're not really told why Daniel avoided this event. And then without warning, they're commanded, when the music plays, to bow down and basically to worship the image. So it's interesting, the music group that Nebuchadnezzar gathers for this occasion, and I spent a bit of time on this, there's some difficulty in translating what the different instruments were. There was a horn of some sort, there was a reed or a piped instrument of some kind. Some people would think it was similar to a bagpipe, so perhaps the Scottish connection. Oh, that's a joke, I don't know. but some kind of wind, some sort of instrument. They think it was like a bagpipe. Stringed instruments, zither, which is a little bit like a harp. I had to look at it. I had no idea what it was. Drums, tambourine. I'd love to have this little, they call it an ensemble in church. I mean, people would be shocked as they walked by. But it was a wonderful little group of instruments that played. And it's just Nebuchadnezzar's way of demanding that there's no other loyalty other than to himself. I command this, you should do it. And he really couldn't understand why people wouldn't do it. If he commanded it, why wouldn't they do it? I mean, he's the king. Nebuchadnezzar sort of getting the idea that he might be a god himself. And this comes out in the next message where perhaps Nebuchadnezzar does quite get to think that way. And anyone that doesn't bow down, well, the warning is that they'll be thrown into the fiery furnace. And so the music plays and they all bow down. Now, as I was preparing this, I was just thinking of other examples of this that I've read about in history. I remember seeing a documentary once on the adoration of Adolf Hitler. I know that in the early 1930s, when Hitler first began to rise to power, there's a lot of German people who were quite sceptical of him. He was short, strange man. And this lady in a documentary talks about how that when Hitler's car, first passed by, she sort of said to herself, I'm not going to bow down to this guy. I'm not interested. But as the car went by, all of the other people, friends that she was there with, they all, if somehow just hypnotised. They all, when everybody just, hail Hitler, raised their arms in a salute, just everybody as one. She said she found herself just caught up, like in some sort of euphoric trance, and just calling out Hail Hitler along with everybody else. And sort of just, it became just overwhelmed with the occasion, I guess. Now, I don't know why, it just seems that the music played and all of them just bowed down. Simple as that, except for three. So the astrologers. Now, we heard about the astrologers last week. They were the most respected group, perhaps, within the kingdom. They interpreted the stars, and they're quite clever in what they did. As I said last week, some of them was probably from Babylon that turned up at the birth of Jesus. So they were very good at interpreting what was going on in the stars. Anyway, they were suspicious of the Jews because the Jews felt that the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, were simply creations by God to bring light upon the world. Whereas in the Babylonian thinking, these heavenly bodies could be, they had a very big influence on people's lives. And you could, a lot about what was happening in the world, you could decide what was happening in the heavens. Whereas the Jews didn't see that at all. They just no interest in that, looking at it in that particular way. And also these three men had been placed in positions of authority. When Daniel had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he said, look, if you can place these three friends of mine. And so they were in important positions throughout the kingdom. And there's a power play going on. They were jealous. These astrologers were jealous of these young Jews. And if you remember that they had been embarrassed by Daniel. So in the dream that the king had, they were not able to tell him at all what his dream was or what it meant, whereas Daniel could. So there was some jealousy, even though Daniel had saved their lives through doing that. That there's a power play going on between these two groups. So they go and tell the king. Verse 12. These three guys neither serve your God nor worship the image of gold you've set up. So the furious rage of Nebuchadnezzar, which just flares up, is very much within his character. But he's a generous and forgiving man. And so he calls them in and says, basically, you're not bowing down to the image, but I'm going to give you another chance. So the music's going to play and you've got a chance to redeem yourself, bow down like everybody else, or you're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So you see that the scene is set up in this chapter where Nebuchadnezzar really issues a challenge to God. If there's a God up there, is he actually able to protect these three guys from this furnace? And then verse 16, they reply, it's already been read, just read it again. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Now, originally this is written in Aramaic, the language of the day, and what was read, what I just read and what Gail read earlier, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand, is uncertain in the original language of exactly what they said. And it's very likely that they just said something like, God can deliver us, but even if he chooses not to. Because that changes the meaning a little bit. They're sort of saying, not saying God will deliver us, but they're saying if God decides to deliver us, then he will. They're leaving the ultimate decision in God's hand rather than saying God will deliver us. They didn't know whether God would deliver them or not. So they're leaving that in God's hands. Just changes the meaning a little, and it's uncertain exactly what they said in the original language. But Nebuchadnezzar sort of got the point. He's pretty blunt. But what choice did they have? Of course, they could have just simply bowed down and worshipped the image. I suppose that was an option they could have had. A few weeks ago, when I did Daniel 1, we talked about boundaries. And these three young guys, they were looking at the perspective from eternity. I mean, they had this life, but then what would happen next? And one day they'd have to give an account of their lives to God. And that would have eternal consequences. They loved God, and there was no way they were going to bow down to this image, no matter what the consequences. So it mattered more that they serve their God than that they obey Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar's furious, and he loses any compassion that he might have been pretending to have or had. And the furnace is ordered to be heated 7 times hotter. Now, we know the furnace could not have been heated 7 times hotter. So this is like using exaggerated language, but the whole chapter is about exaggerated extremes of behaviour and events that occur. There's really no other story in the Old Testament that is more spectacular than this one, is there? You're thrown into a fiery furnace. This is at least right up there with anything else that's in the Old Testament. So I remember reading, and I couldn't find it in preparation for this, but I remember reading a couple of old manuscripts where it had been translated into another language, and it said that when he heated up the fiery furnace, that the flames flew up everywhere. There was smoke like a volcano, probably added later. It's probably an addition to that story, but it doesn't make it sound like, like Walt Disney, nearly exciting. The flames just burst out everywhere, and as the story unfolds. Anyway, some of Nebuchadnezzar's strongest soldiers are called in to bind up. You'd hardly think they needed to be bound up, would you? But that's the way the story goes. So they're tied up in their clothes, all their turbans, and just dressed up. And then they are thrown into the fiery furnace, and the soldiers who threw them in are all burnt to a cinder. Remember that as the story was read. And so the best guess we have from archaeology is that this furnace would have been something like a beehive-shaped furnace. That seems to be the way that they were built in those days, where there was a hole in the top, and that's where the three guys would have been thrown in. And there was also a hole in the side, little hole in the side where you could actually see in what was happening. And so they're thrown in the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar is able to see what's happening. And he looks in, and there he sees that the rope that's binding them is burnt off. And if you read the story, it seems like only Nebuchadnezzar saw the extra figure that was in there. None of the other people that were standing around saw it, just him. And he sees someone that looks like, and once again, that the original is a little bit open to question here, looks like a son of the gods or looks like one of the gods. Not that it really matters, but he would have had lots of gods, and he would have identified this extra figure as one that was similar to one of the gods that he worshipped, because he had no idea about the Jewish God. As you read the story, I would think that this was Jesus in the fiery furnace with him, or maybe one of the angels. And when I come to chapter 7, I'll go through in some detail about back over this story. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar sees another figure walking around in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. So he approaches the furnace, close as he could get, I guess, without being burned himself, and he calls out, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. And there's all sorts of debates about what he actually meant by that, because he didn't really know their God. Come out. So when I'm telling this story in Scripture, because this story comes up in Scripture, I always say to the kids that they called out back, come in and get us. But that's not true. That's just... I just add that because it makes them laugh. Made you laugh too. One of you anyway. And so they come out. Nebuchadnezzar is pretty impressed. So they show no signs of actually even being in the fire at all. And so it says that Nebuchadnezzar praises their God, but he's already done this. Back in chapter 2, when Daniel told him his dream, he praised God. So he has a pretty short memory. And sadly, he doesn't really come in a relationship or want to know any more at all about their God. You would think that when they came out of the furnace, he would say to them, who was that extra guy that was in there with you? Tell us more about what happened. But seemingly it's all to do with power. He's just impressed that they had all this power to be able to survive the furnace. Chapter 4, something else happens to Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll look at that in a couple of weeks. But on this occasion, despite what happened, he doesn't seem to really want to know about the God that's of Daniel from previous chapter, or of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, which is a bit sad really. And then we'll read on. So Nebuchadnezzar continues. They trusted in God and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. I love this. Just shows his sort of extreme character. He's going to hack into anyone now that says something against them, whereas 5 minutes before he's going to hack into them for... Anyway, for no other God can save in this way. So, he may have gone down to his temple and sort of added a statue of their God, which you can't do because their God was invisible. But strange mad Nebuchadnezzar, impressed but not really wanting to know a lot more about their God. But he's going to hack into pieces anyone that says anything negative about that God. So it's just one of those extreme examples in the Old Testament. We read it through, and I've now talked about it. And commentators, people who write commentaries on the Old Testament, they pretty well agree that the story never actually happened. That it's just sort of a made-up story of how God delivered Israel from the fires of exile, etc. So do you believe this story really happened? I guess I could probably have put your hands up. I won't. You put it up we've got a hand up in the back there. It's just interesting how you get people who just don't believe in miracles in the Bible at all. And so they go through and they think, well, how did this story actually evolve? And the interesting thing is there is no corroborative evidence on this story. There's nothing, and you wouldn't expect there to be in the Babylonian historical records. In fact, most of what we know about Babylon, we know from the Bible, with a few little stone tablets and statues and a few other people who wrote about Babylon at the time. We get most of it out of the Bible. And there's nothing about this story anywhere else in other records. And I don't know that you'd expect there to be. But I just simply believe the story. That's God, it's in there. God moved Daniel to know about what happened and to write it. Once you start to doubt things that are in the Bible, then you begin to doubt all sorts of things, including maybe the resurrection of Jesus. Where's the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? Well, there's a lot of evidence for the resurrection for Jesus. But for this particular story, There is no other evidence than what's there in chapter 3 of Daniel. And so you can decide. And if you read the commentaries, most people say, oh, that never really happened, because it's such an amazingly extreme story. But God is quite capable of doing it, and I just believe that's happened the way that it said. So, and you notice that the 3 men are not delivered from the fire, but they're delivered in the fire. And so they were quite prepared to die. There was no question in their mind that they wouldn't die that day. Even though it says God will deliver us, I just don't think that that's a really accurate translation. They were just living up to God, but I think as they were thrown into the fire, they sort of thought, well, we're going to go and be with Jesus or be with God now. And we're quite prepared to do that because we love him so much. And if it means being thrown into the furnace, it would have been a pretty quick death, then we're quite prepared to go through that. So I just go through a couple of other stories. That's really the story. And I'll come back to them in a minute or two. But just how would you go if suddenly you were put on trial in a situation, it could easily come to Australia, although probably not in our lifetime, where if you proclaim Christ in your life as your Lord, it could lead to persecution and even death. There's a story of a lady, I read it quite a few years ago, I just sort of put it together in my mind last night. Her name was Helen Roosevelt, Dr. Helen Roosevelt. She was a medical doctor in the Congo. She was there in the 1960s when there was a Simba Rebellion, 1964, where it was one of the first real reactions to the colonial rule in the Belgian Congo. And there, the rebellion spread throughout the Congo very quickly. And we had a friend, one of our really good friends that was there. He managed to get out before it got to his town, just. Anyway, it says, and I remember reading a book by Helen Roosevelt, that she thought to herself, if ever it came to here, then I wouldn't cope very well. You know, I don't know what I'd do, but I don't know that I would actually be able to stand up against, having my life put under threat. I think I would just fall to bits. But it did come. It came incredibly quickly throughout the Congo, and it came to her town. And when the Simbas, they're called, came into her town, they got all the Westerners, lined them up and began to shoot them. And they were in line, and the guy that was next to her was shot. And then when they came, they were just about to shoot her. Some other officer just drove up in a Land Rover and said, look, stop. No, look, don't kill any more of them. They'd be better used as hostages. And so her life was saved. And she wrote this book about how did she feel when the guns were pointing at her and about to shoot her. And she just said that she just felt the incredible peace of God around her. And just the presence of God, we would say perhaps the arms of God that embraced her even as she, within a few moments, was facing death. So Christians throughout history and right throughout the world today are just faced with the world wanting to squeeze us as Christians into the mould of the world and to compromise our relationship with God. So what does it cost in situations to say, no, I won't cross that boundary because that will offend my God. I'm prepared to take the consequences, but I won't cross that boundary. I wonder how much Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego felt as they were being tied up and about to being thrown into the furnace. All they had to do was to bow down to an idol. But they were not prepared to do that. I'll just give a few examples. So Jeremiah, Jeremiah the prophet, he wrote at about the same time as Daniel. So he's in Israel, and he had a pretty miserable sort of life. He faithfully proclaimed what God had called him to say, but he was harassed and they beat him. One time they threw him down a well, intending to starve him to death down the well, but some of his other, not necessarily friends, but some people found out he was down there and they got him out of the well. At the end of his life, he was dragged off into Egypt against his will, and he's not heard of again, so we don't really know what happened to Jeremiah. But I just mentioned him because he lived at the same time as Daniel, but with quite a different outcome when he spoke the words of God. And right throughout history, so in the early church, After Jesus had ascended, Christians underwent spasmodic persecution, firstly from the Jews and then from the Roman Empire at different times. And then Nero, 65 AD, there was a fire in London. Nero blamed it on the Christians, and many of them were dragged off into the arena or crucified, just falsely accused of something that they had no part in. And at times in the Roman Empire, you were asked, when under persecution, do you name Jesus as Lord or Caesar as Lord? And if you said Jesus as Lord, you were just put to death, pretty well on the spot. And sometimes miracles happen, and sometimes people just face death, and the miracle is that they'll see Jesus on the other side of their death. But there are sometimes interesting miracles, and one that I was reading about is a family in Syria. Now, ISIS came to Mosul, one of the cities in Syria, on the 4th of June 2014. And we know a little about ISIS, it's not all that long ago. And they killed, raped and tortured many innocent people. Not just Christians, many innocent people. But they came to the house of Isa Akrami. Now Isa Akrami was a father, the husband in a Christian family. And they'd lived in that community within Mosul for generations. It was like a Christian community within the city. And he had a wife and two children, two teenage children, and the daughters. Anyway, the ISIS fighters came to his house, and in his words, as he was interviewed about this, they said, "Convert, or you'll never see your wife and children again." So he agreed to convert to Islam, and so they left him, and then only very shortly afterwards, perhaps the next day, they returned and said, "Well, you've got two daughters, and according to Sharia law, if once a girl reached the age of 10, then they must marry." So he said, "We're going to be back in a few days. We expect you to prepare your daughters for marriage, and they're going to be married to a good Islamic fighter." And so as soon as fighters had left, the family just fell onto their knees and prayed to God. "Lord, help us," because they knew exactly what would happen if the girls were taken for marriage. And the bottom had just completely fallen out of their lives. And, it says that Isa he said how sorry he was that he'd said that he'd convert to Islam. But as he was interviewed, he said, "But what would you do? What could I do when faced with a prospect of my family just being, immediately taken away from me?" And he said, "As we fell on our knees and prayed, we had no idea how God might help us." He said, "It suddenly came to our minds, call for a taxi." Call for a taxi? So he said, "We did. And a taxi arrived. And we were taken to safety." It's fairly amazing, because the ISIS, having only just arrived in the city, had not actually closed the loop around the city. And so they were able to get in a taxi and just drive off to safety, which is, it's it's an amazing story, but that's a true story of how one family was rescued, simply, I guess you might say, by God putting into their mind an idea that actually then saved them. However, that was one family. There was 150,000 Christians in Mosul in 2014. Within a few months there were none. They were tortured, had families torn apart, some were able to flee. But basically the Christian community, and not only the Christian community, but many others who in any way were seen as being any kind of threat or they didn't like, they just simply killed. You know how ISIS behaved, and that's not that many years ago. So as we pray in the morning, on Sunday morning, we sometimes mention these groups who you may or may not have heard about: Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Taliban. They're in Iran, Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, Nigeria. They're in Afghanistan. Just a few years ago, August the 15th, 2021, Kabul fell to the Taliban. Now, the Taliban were going to be really nice and do nothing bad to anybody. But within days, they were going door to door, finding anyone that they didn't like, including any Christians, and just killing them on the spot. It was interesting that about 15 years ago, this is when the Americans were still in Afghanistan, I was on the Presbyterian World Missions Committee. And we used to have people come, if anyone was going to be a missionary would come and we would have to approve them if they wanted to be Presbyterian missionaries. And so this girl, she may have been about 30, she came in and we spoke to her and she said she was going to go to Afghanistan. So why would you go to Afghanistan? She says, my family's there. I'm originally from Afghanistan. Well, what do you hope to do? She said, my family must know about Jesus. She said, I'm going to go back and I want to tell them about Jesus. And so we talked to her about this. He said, you know that if this is known, that you're there to tell them about Jesus, that you're going to be killed or tortured or something terrible. She said, yeah, I know that. She said, I expect to die. But she said, they must know about Jesus. You know, and that's, if it means my life, then I'm prepared to pay that price. I have no idea what happened to her. But off she went to go back to Afghanistan to be Christ or a witness to Jesus to her family, who she loved more than life itself. And those sorts of occasions are quite meaningful. We'll have a few people who appeared to the World Missions Committee with a similar kind of total commitment to Jesus, no matter what it might cost them within their lives. Now, we could add to the list of torturers North Korea. There are millions of Christians in refugee camps in different parts of the world fleeing from persecution or death right now, today, different parts of the world. And this could be you. You're fortunate enough to be brought up in Australia where we are not really persecuted at all. But it could be you. And I just encourage you in your prayers to pray for our brothers and sisters in these countries, in many countries throughout the world, that are in pain, in the agony of persecution right now. It's not always easy to fathom why God has made this kind of world and allowed these things to happen within a world that he loves. But the mind of God isn't always easy for us to work out. And it is amazing how in these countries, sometimes under the most incredible persecution, the church still grows. And sometimes it grows quite amazingly as people are brought into a relationship with Jesus, despite the fact that that might mean that they'll come under quite extreme persecution or more. So that's Daniel 3. Basically, it says to us, when the situation is utterly hopeless, God has the power to rescue, and he does, one way or the other, either through a miracle in this life or through death, where it's a miracle of going into the presence of Jesus forever. Both are miracles. So the key is, as we just finished the message now, to trust in Jesus no matter what. That's the decision you need to make in your mind. I'm going to trust in Jesus no matter what it might cost me. So we'll have Daniel 4 in a few weeks. We're going to sing.